All right, in section 3.3, we are looking at your not so favorite section of completing the square. Um, in Algebra 1, you should have covered completing the square, even if it was briefly only for one section. Um, it's not an easy one, but it's an important one that we need to make sure we cover, especially to help us solve quadratics and also to help us get uh, a function into vertex form. And we'll cover that a little bit later on some more. So let's go ahead and I guess kind of show you, well, what exactly is completing the square? It's all this stuff you see here. But what it allows us to do is to take any quadratic and it will allow us to turn it into a binomial squared and allow us to solve it. What does all that mean? Well, it's hard to say just over, just to explain it. It's easier to show you what we're actually doing. But in order to complete the square right here, there is a series of steps that I want to show you. And there's 5 steps that we're going to look at. So you want to make sure you put this out. I'm showing you right here an equation that is in standard form. Y is equal to ax squared plus bx plus c. And in order for us to complete the square, what we're going to do first is isolate the c term, meaning we're going to move it to the other side. So instead of having y there, a lot of times we'll have 0. Or we'll just have our quadratic or trinomial. So we're going to isolate the c term. And then what happens is we're going to take the b term and divide it by 2 and then square. We'll add that number to both sides of the equation in step 3. And usually when we set it up, I want to have it set up where on the left-hand side of my equal sign, we're going to factor. On the right-hand side of the equal sign is where we're going to simplify. And then finally, we go through the steps of solving the problem out. Now, there is one thing to make sure to note, is that you cannot complete the square if the a term is greater than 1. Now, it's not to say that we can't complete the square, because that will be for another day. But just for now, remember, you cannot complete the square if my a term is greater than 1. So if I had like 5x squared, I technically cannot complete the square. There's other steps that I need to do first or before we do all these 5 steps. We're going to split 3.3 up into 2 separate days. So to start off with right here, it says, we'll take a look at exercise 1. And it says solve the equation using square roots. Now when we solve equations using square roots, what we're actually doing is part of a problem that, or I guess part of the steps in actually completing the square. And so you'll see these steps be very familiar when we finally put everything together later on in the lesson. So in step number 1, or in problem 1, step 1, let's go ahead. We want to get, let's see what we could do right here. I have myself a trinomial. Now I could move forward to the other side, but there's something that you got to figure we can do. And what I can do with number 1 to start off with right here is I could factor it. Remember, what are factors of the c term that add up to the b term? Right? Remember, before we had like our little box, and I put plus and multiply. Or sorry, we'll flip that around. Factors first, add on bottom. So factors of 4, multiples of 4 that add up to 4. There's only one set, and this happens when, what you'll notice right here on these problems is that it'll be the same number, 2 and 2. 2 times 2 is 4, 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. So what happens is these happen to be binomial squares. So this right here, we can start off, this x plus 2 times x plus 2. Well, let's go ahead and simplify this and put this as x plus 2 quantity squared is equal to 2. And so now, in order for me to get rid of the exponent, what I'll do to both sides is square root it. And now I have x plus 2 is equal to, and don't forget, when I am solving a problem, we got to make sure we put plus or minus when we square root. And then there's one last step, is we're going to subtract 2 to both sides to get x by itself. So I have negative 2 plus or minus rad 2, and we have now solved it. If I asked for your solution to be in simplest radical form, meaning in making sure you do not have any, no decimals, then this would be the correct answer. One of your solutions would be negative 2 plus rad 2. The second one would be negative 2 minus rad 2. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at number 2 right here. All right, same thing. Let's see. What can I do with this trinomial? I've got to figure out right here what are factors of 400 that add up to negative 40, because that's my b term. So right here, we can go ahead and hopefully you came up with negative 20 and negative 20. Negative 20 times negative 20, positive 400. Negative 20 plus negative 20 is negative 40. So this right here, once again, is x. If we were to write out the binomial, or it's actually t minus 20 times t minus 20. And that's equal to 300. We'll simplify it and put t minus 20 quantity squared is equal to 300. Next up, let's square root both sides. So t minus 20 is equal to plus or minus rad 300. We'll add 20 to both sides, so t is equal to 20 plus or minus rad 300. And always think to yourself, can I simplify this any further? What are some perfect square factors of 300? I can tell you right here, we can simplify this further. Perfect square factors right here, think of 100 times 3. I could take the square root of 100, that's going to be 10. So let's go ahead and simplify this. This will be 20. I'll put plus or minus 10 from the square root of 100 times rad 3. And we've now simplified this out right here. Okay. Number 3. Now this one's a little bit different. I can't just figure out what are factors of the c term that add up to the b term. The reason being is because of that 9 that's out in front. So I have to now figure out, remember, in this instance, let's think about what are factors of 9. So I'll go ahead and list them out right here. How about 3 times 3? And let's list factors of 1. 1 and 1. I have to somehow get negative or positive 6. So remember, the check for this is we're going to go ahead, cross. 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 1 is 3. And this adds up to 6. That means I know that this is my winning combination. I can go ahead and write my binomial. And remember, I go straight across when I write my binomial. So it's going to be 3w plus 1 times 3w plus 1, which is the same thing as 3w plus 1 quantity squared. That's equal to negative 18. And then let's go through the process of simplifying this. To get rid of our exponent, we're going to go ahead and square root both sides. We have 3w plus 1 is equal to plus or minus rad negative 18. Let's go ahead after that. We'll subtract 1 to both sides, so 3w is equal to negative 1. And now, can I simplify this negative 18? Remember, in 3.2, we talked about imaginary numbers. And one of the things we cannot have is a negative under the radical. So what could this simplify down to? Perfect square factors of negative 18. How about 9 and 2? Because I can take the square root of 9. That right there is 3. The square root of negative 9, however, we take it one step forward, will be plus or minus 3i rad 2. And then the last thing I'm going to do right here is divide both sides by 3. All right, and here you go. If you can simplify this further, you probably should. We can simplify this a little bit more. And if we look at it, remember, when we're dividing, we have to divide everything by 3. So technically what happens right here is we have negative 1 divided by 3, which is negative 1/3. I've got plus or minus 3i divided by 3. Well, the 3's cancel out, and I'm left with I rad 2. And there you go. There's your answer. And we have solved for W. All right. Let's go ahead and go to the next part right here. It says on number 4, write the value of C that makes the expression a perfect square trinomial. So remember, what we did in numbers 1, 2, and 3 was we figured out, we were able to factor it, the trinomial, nicely, and it worked out. However, right here, this is another piece to completing the square. Remember I said, all right, first step 1, let's isolate the C term. And then after that, it says, let's take the B term and divide it by 2, and then square it. So that's what I'm going to do right here. My B term, hopefully you realize, is negative 14. Or the A term is with the exponent. The B term is with just the variable. The C term is the constant. So let's take the B term, which is negative 14. It says we divide it by 2, and then we square it. So what I have here right now, negative 14 divided by 2 is negative 7. You square it, and we end up with 49. That right there is your C term. So that is the number that when we were to, and then we have to add it to both sides, and I'll talk about that later on. But let's go ahead. If this will be y squared minus 14y, I'll put right here plus 49. And then right here, we write it as a binomial squared because I can go ahead and figure, all right, factors of 49 that add up to negative 14. Well, remember that B term? We divided by 2, we got ourselves a number. That number is going to be important for our binomial because we just need to put y minus 7 quantity squared. And when you expand it out, it is the same thing as y squared minus 14y plus 49. Let's try that again with number 5. So remember, to find that C term so that we can come up with a binomial, square of a binomial, or a binomial square, take the B term, 17. We'll divide it by 2. Now, if you cannot simplify it nicely, don't. Okay? Don't do anything. You don't want any decimals. We have to keep it in fractional form. Trust me, you're going to need to know how to do that or leave it that way when we do complete the square. So remember, when we have an exponent or a fraction to an exponent, you better take that number to both top and bottom. So 17 squared, 289. 2 squared is 4. All right, and there you have it. There's my C term. So when I want to turn this into binomial squared, remember, that expression that we got right here when we took the B term divided by 2, which is 17 over 2, I'm going to go ahead and put that in my binomial. So my answer is going to be S, and then we have a plus sign here anyways, so it's going to be plus 17 over 2 quantity squared is my expression as a binomial. We'll try one more time right here with number 6. We take the B term. 24 divided by 2. And then we need to square it. Well, 24 divided by 2 is 12, so 12 squared is 144. Remember that number right here that we got when we divided by 2. Well, that's going to be in my binomial right here. And I'm going to go ahead and write my binomial as z plus 12 quantity squared. And don't forget, if you were to FOIL this out right here, that will get us our z squared plus 24z plus 144, which would be right here. Okay, so this z plus 12 quantity squared is the same thing as z squared plus 24z plus 144. And if you don't believe it, well, you can go ahead and FOIL it out. All right, we're going to start with the basics of completing the square right here. And you may need a separate sheet of paper. I would probably recommend it. I know it's going to be very tight for me to plug it into this little space here. Okay, so for the sake of your notes and making it clean, because there's a lot of things going on here as well. So I'm going to have to probably erase things as I go along the way, or have it spread out between the three different problems here. So I would recommend these next problems that we're looking at to do it on a separate sheet of paper. All right. So remember, we have in our equation a, b, and c. Step 1 in completing the square says let's isolate the c term, so let's move it to the other side. So we have r squared minus 6r. We're going to add 2 to both sides. And then there's a blank spot where that c term once was. And then let me go ahead and put 2, because I added 2 to both sides. Okay, so I isolated the c term by adding 2 to both sides. I'm going to have a little space there, because what I'm going to do is some of the steps that we just did earlier on in our last example. And then I'm going to put plus, and then I'm going to leave a space here. And then we're going to go to step 2. Step 2 says let's take this the b term, which is -6. And let me go, I'll put that in green. That shows up a little bit easier. Take the b term, we're going to divide it by 2, and then we're going to square it. So -6 divided by 2 is -3. You square that, we end up with 9. Remember, the number that we get when we divide by the b term is important, and we're going to use that later on. So what I'm going to do now is this. The value that I got, that 9, I'm going to plug that in to the 2 blank spots. Remember, when we are in algebra, you do something to one side, you got to do it to the other. So I'm adding 9 to both sides of the equation. Next step says, all right, let's go ahead and factor on the left. So this is factorable. This is a binomial squared. This is r minus 3 quantity squared. Say how? Remember, that number that I divided by 2, go ahead and plug that in right here. It'll always work out. That right there is equal to 11. And now the rest of the steps is just solving this out. You did that on number 1, right? So that's why all those steps that we just did, we'll do it again. We'll square root both sides. R minus 3 is equal to, and don't forget, plus or minus rad 11. We're going to add 3 to both sides, and r is equal to 3 plus or minus rad 11. And there you go. You have just completed the square. Hopefully, maybe you did that in Algebra 1, and you said, oh, this is too easy. Maybe not. So we got to keep working on it. Let's go ahead and try number 8. All right, so let's start with our steps right here. First off, our a term is equal to 1. So we can go ahead and just keep completing the square. We're going to isolate the c term. So I got x squared plus 10x plus blank is equal to negative 28 because I subtracted that to both sides of the equation. Step 2, we take our b term. We have 10. We will divide it by 2, and then we will have to square it. So I've got 5 squared is equal to 25. I'll underline this 5 right there because we will be using that number later on. And then in the blank spots, hopefully you are one step ahead and are plugging in 25 into there. We're going to factor on the left. So I got x plus 5, quantity squared. How do I know it's plus 5? Because this is a positive 5 right here. The number I got when I took the b term and divided by 2. Then that is going to be equal to negative 28 plus 25. So that's going to get us negative 3. Next up, square root both sides. I've got x plus 5 is equal to rad negative 3. We'll subtract 5 to both sides, and I got negative 5. And then don't forget, there should be plus or minus right here. So plus or minus rad negative 3. We cannot have a radical that has negative inside of it. So we got to get our imaginary number. X is equal to negative 5 plus or minus. And then we can go ahead and put negative 1 times 3 as our factors. And the square root of negative 1 is I. So we have I rad 3. And there is your answer. Next up, let's take a look at number 9. Things get a little more complex right here. We have to deal with some fractions. But hopefully you're not scared of them and you will be owning these fractions right here. So how do we start off? Well, remember, both of these, if you look, we have ourselves like a trinomial. This one we have a binomial and a term out in front. I would start off, let's go ahead, make it look more homey and similar to number 7 and 8, and let's distribute the y. So we've got y squared plus y, and there is no c term. So let's go ahead, we'll go ahead and leave a little blank spot right there. And then I'll have 3/4 plus a blank here as well. So this is where things get tricky, right? Our job is to take the b term. Our b term is 1, right? There's a 1 in front of the y. That invisible 1 right here. So let's take the b term, we'll divide it by 2, and we have to square it. Remember, do not give decimal numbers and answers. That will make things much more complicated than it should be when you're working on these problems. This is 1/2 times 1/2, which is 1/4. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is we'll put 1/4 in these empty spots. This next part is easy. You're saying, how am I supposed to factor this out on the left side? Well, remember, what did we get when you took the b term and divided by 2? I got 1/2. So this is going to turn into 1 plus 1/2 quantity squared. That right there is equal to 3/4 plus 1/4, which equals 1 whole. Or you can say 1/1 if that makes things a little bit easier for you. Then we continue on. We'll go ahead and start solving by square rooting both sides. So y plus 1/2 is equal to square root of 1, which is 1. And we'll put plus or minus 1. We got to get y by itself by subtracting 1/2 to both sides. So y is equal to negative 1/2 plus or minus 1. And this one we can simplify pretty easily. Negative 1/2 plus 1 is equal to 1/2. The second answer right here, negative 1/2 minus 1, that right there will be negative 3/2. And there's your two answers. When we come back next time, we will be dealing with problems 10 and the rest of this section. Make sure you have a full grasp of this, or else the next section, or part B of 3.3, won't be as fun. Bye-bye.